On October 25th, 2011, 32-year-old humanitarian aid worker Jessica Buchanan was kidnapped at gunpoint along with a fellow colleague and held for ransom by a band of Somali pirates. After 93 days, her captors grew impatient, waiting for a ransom to be paid as the negotiations for their release were at a standstill. And Jessica's medical state had become a life or death issue. In her book, Impossible Odds, The Kidnapping of Jessica Buchanan and Her Dramatic Rescue by Navy SEAL Team 6 is a multifaceted story of intuition, faith, love, and terror so difficult to describe that it can strip away the very essence of a human being. And when hopelessness comes to trap the victim, you will hear about the powerful miracle that mirrors the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Ladies and gentlemen, to tell her story, let us welcome Jessica Buchanan. Well, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let me ask you this because I read your story from cover to cover. And when you were living in Somalia, you dedicated your life to saving the children with the landmine awareness program and the prevention of future mutilations. How successful was your work there?
Well, I think it's a collective, it's a combined effort of all the humanitarian efforts and organizations that were working in field locations, such as the one I was in. I think we had a pretty good, run, a pretty good record of helping educate kids and families about the dangers of leftover explosives and munitions that had been basically just littered around their country in the aftermath of civil war. Even if it had been 20 years, we were still digging up stockpiles of explosives, and there were still landmines out in the fields, which is problematic in a place like Somalia because it's a nomadic um, desert region, and people are moving constantly with their livestock. And so, kids would see something shiny and pick it up, and it could explode because even if it's 20 years old, it still has explosives in it. And so, while I can't necessarily quantify how many people we helped or saved, I'd like to think that we did our part in keeping a lot of kids from going blind or having some really hard um, injuries to deal with.
Well, I understand that when you had gone to Africa, you had gone to a school and in one day's time erupted in gunfire. Was that a wake-up call on how dangerous the job you were doing?
Well, my first trip to Africa when I went to South Sudan, I mean, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was very naive, very idealistic. Um, I am not sure I still, even after that, understood the, just the very impactful, life-threatening situations I could possibly find myself in as a foreigner, especially. When you're young and you're passionate and committed to what you feel you've been called to do, it's hard to take into account the risks that might incur. I
Yeah.
can see that now, several years later, and a lot of life experience later. Um, but I think it definitely goes to show that when a person feels passion and commitment to a cause or a people group or whatever it is, their art, it's they're unstoppable. And that was definitely me. I felt very, very committed to what I believed I could do in order to help a small part of the world. It can be argued whether or not that's true, but for me at the time it was.
No, I believe that. And when I was reading your story and just thinking about that day of just that one day when you ended up at that school and all of a sudden, I mean, gunfire everywhere, and I'm thinking,
Mm,
this woman she's passionate, she,
hmm.
and of course it was a way. I think in a way it was kind of a wake up call to the dangers of the area,
Yeah.
but your passion for Africa never wavered after that. Now, you were
Mhm.
going to an area known as the Green Line, an area that's never included on any official maps in Somalia. What is that region?
So at the time, it was a place that was basically, it was calm. It was like the Switzerland of Somalia in the sense that it was divided two areas, like land areas, where they were dominated by two different clans. There was a lot of conflict between these two clans in particular, and that we always knew, hopefully, that as expats or aid workers, development workers, we were never really the target of whatever was going to, take place. It was usually clan conflict. But this area was a place that everybody agreed could kind of stay calm and was kind of off limits in terms of the violence or crossing over. So what that meant was working for the organization at the time that I was working for, they had their field office in the north of the Green Line and their guest house. So that's where we stayed and where most of the operations took place. You would take a convoy of vehicles to the Green Line, get out, cross over the Green Line by foot, and then get in a second convoy of vehicles that were licensed for the southern part of the Green Line. Vehicles weren't allowed to cross over. Clan members didn't cross over. I, as an expat, could. So it took a lot of logistical finessing to get back and forth, but we had an office in south of the Green Line, with staff that belonged to that particular clan. So my job was to go in and train all of them.
Well, I understand that you had already kind of pushed back this
Mhm,
trip twice, but what were
mhm.
your concerns of the trip prior to your kidnapping?
Well, my concerns were that I was not providing life-saving. I was not on a life-saving mission. I wasn't providing medical care or food. I was providing training for our local staff, which was important. We needed to get our job done. We needed to fulfill the promises that we had made to the community and also to our donors. I got that. But there was a lot of tension in the area. There was a lot of conflict between the clans. So the first two trips that I had planned to go down there, I canceled because at one point, a bus full of women and children had been blown up. And I mean, I was basically afraid I was just going to get caught in the crossfire. That's what I figured, I had to worry about. And I remember talking to my colleague who was taken with me on the phone maybe a week prior to this actual trip that did take place. And he was based down there, so he was supposed to have a good a finger on the pulse of what was happening. And of course, we had security advisors that were located there and in Nairobi, and their whole job was to make sure things were to keep their finger on the pulse of the security in the region.
Now, your
And I said,
husband, uh
I I
well,
said I didn't want to go. And he told me, well, I'll, call your supervisor then and let them know that you're not fulfilling your duties, your job.
sound like a threat.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
yeah, like if you don't go, you'll lose your job kind of thing.
Yeah.
But your
Hmm.
husband, Eric, and there's a whole story there, but we're going to get to that. But your husband, Eric, told you before you left, and I know he didn't want you to go. He had
Mm-mm.
this same feeling of intuition, and he said to you to stay aware and trust your gut feelings. But then
Hmm.
you were at the NGO safe house the night before leaving, and you text your husband, if I get kidnapped on this trip, will you come and get me? When I first read that, it was almost a little bit of, I guess, humor between husband and
Yeah.
wife. Um, but it seems both of you had the same intuition, that same gut feeling about this trip. What made you push past your sixth sense?
Self-doubt.
Really? Self doubt.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. Um,
Why?
well, it was an abandonment of myself, really. It was, me walking away from what I knew was my truth because I felt pressured, I felt bullied, I felt like everybody else knew better than I did. Um, I had a dream actually the night before, I left to go, that I was kidnapped by pirates, and I know clearly that my intuition, um, the universe, God, whatever your belief system is, was screaming at me to listen to save my life. And I ignored it because I was a woman working in a male dominated environment. I had worked really hard to keep my job, to get to where I was. It doesn't sound like it probably to a lot of people because it's not exactly glamorous, but these jobs are hard to get and they are hard to keep, and there is a lot of competition. And you do it all I don't know. I think women do it a lot, but I think people just in general, women and men do it a lot. They just tell themselves that they're being paranoid and they push things down and they abandon themselves. And that's what I did. And of course, I didn't remember that I'd had the dream until like 40 or 50 days into the captivity. I
Re-
like, yeah,
Well,
I didn't remember.
okay. Well, let me ask you this real quick because thinking back and knowing that you pushed back, you pushed through and shoved intuition to the back seat. Now, 10 years later, when you have an intuition that tells you something, do you listen now?
Oh, yeah.
Or I
Yeah.
should say,
And
do you
I
listen more
mean,
keenly now, is what I should say.
yes.
You
Well,
do.
it's interesting because like after the kidnapping and the rescue and I got out, I had this weird like fear, I guess you could say that um my intuition was broken somehow. Like I had,
Yeah.
like broken it or it had been destroyed. Like this because I really see like us as people, like I see myself working in collaboration with my intuition and building relationship. And just like any relationship you have in your life, it takes practice in understanding and communication and really listening. And so I am very, very intentional about how I operate in my life now in terms of listening to myself. And I set aside time to practice that. I really believe that it has to be an intentional thing that some of us really have to learn.
Yeah, it is. And I think by learning that, that is an internal power that probably most people never tap into. We
Hmm.
kind of float through people, a lot of people float through
Hmm.
life. And when that intuition or that maybe it's God talking to you and telling you not to do
Hmm.
this or not to go there or warning you about something. Some
Hmm.
people don't know what to do with those kind of things. And I think you've explained it perfectly. We need to really just sit there. We need to learn because those things can save us from even something as dramatic
Yeah.
as your situation. So let's
Hmm.
talk about the day of the kidnapping. You noticed a new driver, and that didn't sit very well with you. Why was that?
I just I didn't feel comfortable again, and I ignored that. And I deferred to my colleague because it was his duty station. It wasn't mine. So it wasn't, so uncommon that I wouldn't notice or like that I wouldn't recognize the driver. But you need to like know who who is coming and going from the compound and who is getting in and out of your vehicle in situations like this. And the fact that no one seemed to really know who he was very disconcerting. But at that point, I was like, okay, well, we've done it. We're at the end. This is the third day. I was at the finish line, right? Like,
Mm.
I just needed to get in the car, get the 15-minute drive over with, get across the green line, get to the guest house, and I had a flight scheduled the next morning, and I didn't know if I was ever gonna come back. Not that anything bad had happened, it had been fine, but I was so stressed the entire time because I knew I shouldn't be there.
Well, I'm reading your book. I'm reading this whole story and I'm dissecting it. I mean, seriously, I
Mhm,
spent a lot of time reading, dissecting, thinking, pondering. And when you didn't feel easy by seeing this new driver, even if you would have raised your voice of concern, it wasn't going to change the situation because immediately a large car comes up beside the SUV you were in with men in their AK-47s. But I want to quote from your book because you wrote at that very moment, my heart goes straight to my throat. Adrenaline sends a jolt of fear from head to toe, and the terror feels like heat, like we are suddenly being roasted alive inside the car. Now,
mhm,
that sounds like you knew this was more than a carjacking.
mhm. I knew in that moment that my life had changed forever.
Really.
Yeah,
And not knowing if it was going to be, well, if you were going to live past that moment.
yeah, yeah, and if I did, then nothing would ever be the same again. It fundamentally, like, one life ended and a whole new life began.
Well, my thought is you knew the dangers of working in such a volatile area of the world, but it didn't stop your work. And I can completely understand that because when we are passionate about something or if we're passionate about helping other people,
Mm,
nothing is going to stop us. But did you think
mhm.
something like this would ever happen to you?
No, no, I mean, it didn't happen ever. You know, there had been a rash of kidnappings, like, a couple of Spanish girls had been taken on the border. They were working up in a refugee camp, and it happened, like, a week before mine did, and I remember my husband telling me about it, and I was like, "Wow, that's terrible," and then I just went on with my business and, my work, and, um, I think a lot of us go around believing, and I don't especially I grew up in a very, like, religious environment and a very faith-based kind of upbringing. I think a lot of us believe, whether we want to say it out loud or not, that bad things like that don't happen to people like me.
Right.
I'm a school
Yes.
teacher from Ohio. I'm just a girl, nothing, I'm not doing anything too risky. I mean, some would say yes, but you also have to understand that, like, I'm not, like, just out there gallivanting around by myself. Like, I am employed by an international organization that has procedures and staff and protocols, and they are supposed to take all the measures so that we can do the work. I mean, countries pour millions of dollars into providing funding for this work because it provides infrastructure, and ultimately it makes the entire world a safer place. Hopefully that's the
Yes.
that's the objective. um and there are those who are, do go out on their own and do their own thing, and things happen, and it's unfortunate, but I also feel like I always need to stress, like, this was my job, and yes, it was a risky job, but it's just like any other, any kind of job, you assume some sort of risk, and
Well,
it was
I,
a little different.
I knew that. So when your SUV was attacked, and ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to read the book because there's so much detailed here.
Mhm.
But you knew then when the pirates pulled the driver out, and then you knew he was a part of them. But correct?
Well, I can't say right then I knew. I think it took me a while to put it all together, right? Like, at the time of the kidnapping, like, all you aren't putting any thoughts together.
Right. Yeah.
You don't
Of
know what's
course.
happening.
Well, and that's what I want to get into is is some of the thought process. But the first thought was for you and your colleague to survive the first 24 hours.
Yeah.
Was that part of any training you received working for the NGO?
I did go through an internal, what they would call a heat training, a hostile environment awareness training, I believe is what it stands for, conducted by our regional security advisor and a few consultants that he brought in. And there had been a morning spent on um, kind of like a kidnapping reenactment in a way, and what to think about if you were kidnapped. And of course, we're all like kind of paying half attention because, you know, what are the chances that's going to happen? Um, but I do remember them saying two things: that if you make it through the first 24 hours, most likely they're going to keep you alive. And then the second thing is that you needed to have a phone number memorized because they're going to want to make a point of contact with somebody. So the only phone number I had memorized actually was my dad's. I didn't have my husband's. Because he had like six phone numbers because he traveled all over everywhere. So I could never keep track of where he was and what phone numbers he was using. But I had my dad's phone number memorized. Um, but it took about a week before we were allowed to make a phone call. And
Well,
then when we finally did, we realized something larger was at play here because all the phone numbers had been disconnected.
yeah, and I understand that on the other side, and ladies and gentlemen, this story is multifaceted.
Hmm.
There's Jessica's story, there's Eric's story, and there are other little stories within this whole ordeal. And I know Eric really spent time because he was so smart because he disconnected as much of anything online that was connected to you, connected to him, connected to family to make sure nobody would be in direct contact with them, that the pirates or the terrorists would have to go directly talking either with the NGO or
Hmm.
to the FBI. But let me ask you this, because as I was dissecting your story, and I look at the emotional standpoint here, because to me this is very important for people to really grasp. I mean, we watch the news today. When something happens, we're like, "Oh wow, that's bad," and then
Hmm.
and then 2 minutes later, we're thinking about what we're going to get for lunch. So
Right.
we've become numb, and I don't want people to be numb. So the first night of your kidnapping, you and your colleague were taken out into the desert brush, and you were told to get on your knees. Did you think execution was coming?
Yes. Yes. It's so interesting because I think every human being wonders, like, what are those last moments before you die going to be like? Um, I did not see mine playing out that way, but I had, 15 minutes, 20 minutes to walk and to say my goodbyes. I said goodbye to my husband. I said goodbye to my father. My mother had passed away the year before, very suddenly and unexpectedly, and I was still very much in the throes of grieving her. And so, actually, it was almost a comfort in a way because I called out to her and asked her to, help me be strong and help me be dignified and to wait for me. I felt like I had. It didn't seem as scary because I knew she was on the other side waiting for me. Somehow, I knew that. Um, and then when they told us to get down onto our knees, just that, it's not numbing, it's everything. You're feeling every single sensation that your body can possibly make all at the same time because it's the last time you're gonna feel it.
And adrenaline is flowing 100
Yes.
miles an hour. And
Yes.
people have no idea that, it's fight or flight. But
Yeah.
in a way, I think there's a third F word here that some people don't understand is freeze.
Yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
move. But
No.
I was kind of well, I'm not going to say surprised, because it is your story. It is it's disturbing. I will
Mhm.
say that. And you explained in the book two ways. And ladies and gentlemen, please forgive me for being graphic, but we're talking about real life here.
Mhm.
And but you explained in the book two ways beheading could occur. So
Mm.
again, forgive me for being graphic, but I want the viewers to get a sense of the terror you felt because it's real and it truly exists. And you write in the book, a quick single cut with a long blade for instant death, or the kitchen knife from the throat on back for the victim to remember it until death comes. How
Mhm.
did you think of that with the fear that was gripping you at the time? I'm sure they could have just used the AK-47.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting because I think it was my terror that caused me to think that I was gonna be beheaded that way. I don't think there were ever any, like, knives or swords or, like, bayonets or anything present, but I could see that, like, that's what I thought I saw. But in retrospect, I don't think that that was the reality. I just think it was my terror and how I thought things were gonna play out. And when you hear that phrase, like, your life flashes before your eyes, like, it really truly does. And then when you're on your knees waiting for life to end, how you're gonna die flashes before your eyes. What are they gonna do, and how are they gonna do it, and what's it gonna feel like? Is it gonna hurt? How long is it gonna take? Maybe that's just me, I don't know.
No, no,
And
no. No, I completely agree with that. I mean, because again, I mean, as I was reading your book, I worked to basically slip myself into your situation and really understand and feel every essence of what you were going through. And,
Mhm,
again, we watch the news and we just kind of pass it off as another news day, but these
mhm,
things are happening. These things are happening and they're not being reported on. And so people don't understand. So when you're on your knees, okay, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to make sure I got out the timeline correct. If I counted correctly, there were probably at least 3 or 4 times in your book that you screamed out to God in vocal silence. I thought that was very
mhm.
important on how that was written. You scream silently with all of your heart and your soul, knowing full well that you will not be able to scream once they decided to kill you. Was
Mhm.
there some sort of knowing that only God can save you now?
It's all you have left. And I can't imagine anybody who, even if you're not a believer, I think when you are on your knees surrounded by men with weapons, you're gonna call out to something. Um,
Well, then let me
and
ask
you
you. Well, let me ask you this because and that I completely agree with you, Jessica. You will call out to something
Mhm,
no
mhm,
matter what because you're grasping for the very last thing that
mhm,
you pray and hope is going to save
mhm,
you.
mhm,
But there was an important quote in your book. It was very profound to me in a way that I never even thought of it because we've become so
mhm,
numb in this world. And you wrote, there are people who live their faith and murderers who hide behind it. Now, I know that
mhm,
you saw this hypocrisy during your ordeal. And I mean, and you can, I mean, there's a cast of characters within this story praying
mhm,
5 times a day and holding people for ransom. Hey, no sin in
mhm,
that. That was their mentality.
mhm.
And and there's another the way your book, the way that I think I picked up a lot of your personality. Um, you have a humor that's a little bit on the sarcastic side,
Yeah,
which I could absolutely
a
relate
little
to.
bit.
I can relate to that. Uh,
Mhm,
that's kind of where I'm at sometimes.
mhm,
And you would look at these people, these men that were holding you and your colleague hostage, and you're thinking, my gosh, these guys are a bunch of dum dums because
yeah,
you knew
sometimes.
things and you noticed things that they didn't
Mhm,
realize. And one of those things I just kind of want you to explain is they held you basically undercover by day, but you
Mhm.
were out in the open by night. And when did you finally hit you that don't these guys know about modern day surveillance?
Yeah. Well, they don't, because it's kind of like it's very primitive. I mean, a lot of these, I mean, they have phones and things, but I think the understanding of what is out there, I mean, I'll be honest, I had no idea that like a military intervention was anything that was possible. So if I didn't, as an American citizen, I just thought they came after military folks. I didn't know they came and helped civilians. Um, if I don't know that, then are they gonna know it? They just know what they see in movies that they've seen every once in a while, I
Well,
think.
and there's a whole nother story there, and I understand because you explained in the book that they would see the airplanes parked at the airport at night. Nobody flying in,
Mhm.
nobody flying out. So they thought, well, planes don't fly at night. So in a way, they thought that when they took you and your colleague out into the brush at night,
Yeah.
out in the open to so-called sleep,
Mhm.
um, that no one would
That we
see
were
you.
safe. Yeah.
Yeah.
I almost think because I asked several times, like, "Why are we sleeping out in the open at night?" Like, I wasn't gonna say anything about what possibly could be flying around out there. Um, I sometimes I think that it was superstitious too, I think that they maybe thought there was something having to do with like spirits or something under trees at night. I could never get the full story, but they would mention something. I think they were afraid to sleep under the trees at night, like the bottom line. So they felt safer out in the open, which worked out well for me in the end.
Well, okay, so during captivity and due to your work with the NGO, you were considered non-political and non-religious aid worker. So in your own words, you were considered the worst kind of kidnapping victim. Why was that?
Well, I mean, who's going to come after me? Who's going to pay for me? Um, I'm not worth very much if I'm not political or religious or ideological, right? Like, who's going to know? So, I definitely, the only dollar sign they had to cash in was my American passport. So, I just think honestly, I was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't think I was ever the target. I think my colleague Paul was, and it just happened that I was there on
Well,
that day,
well, you
and I
know,
got 2 for the price of 1.
yeah, and to me, I think that they may have been looking the fact that you're white, you're blonde, you got to be worth something, and on top of that, you're
Yeah,
American. So,
mhm.
uh,
I don't think they knew I was American until they had gone through all my stuff, though.
ah.
So, it could have been "Oh, we just screwed up," or a party. I don't know.
Well, let's talk about your husband, Eric, just for a moment. Describe him for us.
Eric. He is, I like to say he's a bulldog. He is a Swedish citizen, and he'd been working in Africa for, at that point, probably about 12, 13 years. Mostly with refugees and mostly in Somalia. And he had been around a block or two and knew the region as well as I think any foreigner is gonna understand it. I don't know. I don't think he would say he understood it well at that time, but he was definitely more informed than a lot of the people who are working on the case in terms of the region and what um, the way these guys were probably thinking.
Well,
And he's tenacious.
he had a military background.
Yes, yes. He was in the Swedish, special forces, I guess.
And to the point to where the FBI was afraid that he was going to go out and get you on his own.
Yeah, that was definitely a concern, and I definitely think that was a backup plan. Like if things didn't start moving in the right direction,
Well, let me ask you this because
he, yeah.
in captivity, I'm sure that you probably had a million conversations with yourself.
Mhm.
And when you got kidnapped, did a little devil pop up on your shoulder telling you that Eric was probably going to tell you, I told you so?
Oh, no. No, I knew that he was absolutely doing whatever he could do. He was pounding down every door. I knew he was probably flipping tables over, making people listen. I knew in my heart, deep, deep down, that he was doing everything he could possibly do and then some.
And
So
that
I
and
took comfort in that.
that is fantastic. And when I read the story of your husband Eric, and when I see the pictures of Eric, I'm thinking that is a guy that I don't think I want to meet in a dark alley. He literally, I think he would, and this is a compliment. He almost
Mm.
looks like a mercenary in a good way.
My my uncles still do not believe that he just does development work, but I'm like, yeah, no, he does. He's from Sweden.
There you go. Well, when Eric called your father John to tell him you had been kidnapped, Eric seemed to be stabilized by the internal workings of your father's faith.
Mm.
Explain the influence your father John had on your husband Eric during this time.
I think the first act of grace that Eric received was that my father didn't blame him for this happening. I think it would have been easy for him to do so. I'm his daughter, and like I had mentioned, my family had just gone through a very severe trauma, losing my mom. Um, but my dad knew me, and he knew my personality, and he knew how committed and passionate I was, and no one could ever tell me any different. So I was going to do what I was going to do. Um, and I think that that set the tone for keeping the family together. There were definitely rough patches, but a situation like this will either bring a family closer together or it'll tear them apart. And more often than not, it tears them apart. And we have been very fortunate. And I think a lot of that had to do with my dad and his just rock solid faith. Um, I use this as my mantra during captivity, and I use it today in the hard times. But I remember the day after my mom passed away, and we were all just like speechless, like we just didn't know what to do with it. And um, we gathered in the kitchen the next morning, and my dad asked us. The three of us were all adults at this time. My brother was very young though, like 21, and to gather around the kitchen table to pray. And I just remember him grabbing the top rung of the chair, like holding onto it. His knuckles were white, and all he said was, "Lord, I don't understand, but I choose to trust." And I think that that has been a guiding light for my dad throughout his life. He's a very quiet man, and he would never get on and do an interview like this. But he very much modeled that for his children. And so I use that as I walked in circles around my mat every day. I mean, I would say it like thousands of times during the day. Like, I don't understand, but I choose to trust. I don't understand, but I choose to trust. And I think that comes down to just the bigger theme of the whole ordeal for me is that we have a choice. And this whole thing came about through a series of choices. I chose to ignore my intuition, and it led me down this path, right? And while I wouldn't wish to do it again, I'm also on the side that I can be grateful for it now because of what I have learned, um, and the meaning that I have made out of it. And I think I can attribute that just a lot to my dad and to the presence, that he's always been.
You know, as I was reading the very words that he had prayed standing in the kitchen, I mean, I read them over and over again, and it's a strong reference to Proverbs 3 and 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own
Mhm,
understanding. And
mhm,
uh, but the way that your father had prayed it was something so real,
mhm,
but it was something that I could see what how he used that to take comfort in, that you used to take comfort in. And I
mhm,
think a lot of people, when they read your book, read your story, and come across that one section of the book and read what your dad had said and what he had prayed, I think a lot of people will wake up and understand that we don't have to understand.
mm.
You know, we
Well, it's
trust.
surrender. It's surrender. And
Yeah.
I think that that is basically, at least for my life, it's been the theme is surrendering to what is happening and the flow of what is happening. And
You know, and it was, you know, as I was reading that, and there was such strong power that I don't think a lot of people will ever understand. And here you are, and as you said, you know, you're walking around the tree, and you're saying this over and over again, and it is a very powerful prayer in which I know that God heard.
mhm,
And but at the same time, even though we surrender, we allow ourselves to just be free with God. Whatever you have, I will accept, and I
mhm,
will like it. And it all comes down to trust. That's all it comes down to
yeah,
is pure trust.
yeah,
But so in that, I want to take a little bit of a 180 here
mhm.
because, ladies and gentlemen, this is building a story, and praise the Lord, it has a happy ending. So, but and this one word is used so many times in your book. You have to tell us what it is and what is cat. How did that cause increased
Mhm.
terror in your situation? And ladies and gentlemen, when I say cat, I don't mean the animal. It's spelled
No, there were no
K A
cats.
K H A T. What is that, and why did it increase the terror in your situation?
So it's cot, chat. It can be referred to, and it's a green leaf. Essentially, it's a plant, and it's a narcotic. And in Somali culture, I think Ethiopian, a lot of Kenyan parts of Kenya, um, Djiboutian, they chew this leaf, and it becomes pasty, and it basically gives you the same effects as having like
Cocaine?
12, yeah, like it's just speed basically. And I don't think it like lasts as long, but it's highly addictive, and it also makes you paranoid and very trigger happy. And in my situation, but it's just widespread. Men sit from probably 3 till like 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night everywhere. And they chew this plant, they drink their tea, and it's very communal. It's a very community centered, like it's would be the equivalent of us, like I guess, sitting around in the afternoon and having bottles of wine or something and just visiting. Um, but everybody does it. And it's addictive. So if you don't get your fix the next day, then you're in a really bad mood. Like, think how, I don't know if you drink coffee, but if you don't get your coffee in the morning, like that makes me in a bad mood. We'll multiply this by like 20.
Well, how
And it's awful.
unnerving. Well, how unnerving was it to see these 20 or so men
Mhm.
doing this substance all day long. And you mentioned in the book how trigger happy or accidental shooting. I mean, you and your
Mhm.
colleague could have been accidentally shot and
Yes.
killed, and the
Yeah.
whole situation would have been over.
Yep.
The constant ramblings of these
Mhm.
guys would have drove me nuts. I was like, somebody give her an AK-47 so she could just shut them up because
Don't think I didn't think about that.
yeah, I bet. And the erratic
Mhm.
behaviors. And there was a few times in which you explained in the book, you kind of stood your ground,
Mhm.
and they're not used to a woman
Mm-mm.
uh, either back talking or
Mm-mm.
showing strength. That is something that they
Mhm.
usually don't tolerate.
No. No. And I mean, I could have got myself killed several times, and there were moments where I was so, like, filled with righteous rage that I was willing to take the risk because I just, I can't even off the top of my head remember what the instances were, but I mean, things like I needed toilet paper. You got me living outside in I mean, there are just some things that I need. And I remember getting into a big, huge shouting match with Abdi, who was the leader at the time. And he waves his AK-47 at me and screams at me, "Do you want to die?" All because I just asked for some toilet paper. That's it.
Well, that's where I want to go. I want to kind of go not too deeply, but there, like I said, there's quite a list of characters in your ordeal. It could take another hour just to kind of go through them,
Mm,
but one of them kind of stuck out to me, and that was Crack Baby.
mm.
Um, Explain Crack Baby for us.
He was a baby and he chewed chat. He was maybe probably my son's age. I don't know, 8, 9, and he was learning the family trade. He was there the night of the kidnapping. I mean, there's so many times he could have died, should have died. Um, the problem with him, he was mean, just mean. I think he was probably born mean and then learned how to be mean. And then, I'm sure had experienced so much trauma that his, like, emotional development was stunted. And so he would do things like pull a knife on me and jab me in the neck. Like, I didn't know if he was going to slit my neck while I was asleep, if he was just going to, like, haul off and shoot me. He didn't understand cause and effect. He didn't have the developmental uh, progress to be able to understand, like, hey, if I shoot her, then, this whole thing goes under. So I didn't see him after New Year's Day when we got into a standoff and he almost stabbed me because I wouldn't move 6 inches to the left.
Well, I understand that he had a bracelet. And when you
Hmm.
saw the bracelet, and I want to let you explain that to everybody. When you saw the bracelet, uh, you said something in the book, and it was an eye opener of the kind of work that is done over in that part of the world. And you asked yourself, did all the work we do here, did it even really matter? Can you explain what you meant
Hmm.
by that?
Yeah, I realized a couple of days into the captivity, he came out to taunt me about something, and he had this red, like, those awareness bracelets that people wear for
Mhm.
causes, like the silicone bracelets. He had a red one, and I thought it looked really familiar. And then once I got closer, I realized it was from my organization, and it was part of, some of the stuff that we had handed out to different communities for educational purposes on mind risk education awareness. And he had been, like, attending the seminars and the trainings that I had put together and had probably even been at. And you think going into this, I'm a humanitarian aid worker, this thing is going to get resolved really quickly. Like, the community believes in us and has accepted us, and they're going to put pressure. And then you realize quickly, like, this is so much bigger than just the community and the work we've done. This is a huge network that goes back to the US, probably somebody sitting somewhere calling the shots from their phone. And there are moments where you're like, does it even matter? Like, does any of this that I have given myself to in my life to, does any of it matter? And
Yeah.
those were some dark moments.
Yeah, and that's how I read that. When you were telling that story, I always thought, oh my gosh. I mean, it's almost like, gee, you're just going to add hopelessness on top of your own personal hopelessness, per se.
Mhm.
But there were other characters. You mentioned uh, uh, Abdi, there was Adhere,
Mhm.
there was Jabril, which
Mhm. Yeah.
nah, I don't
Not
like
my
him.
favorite.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
Then there was Dahir, there was the chairman, Colonel, and so
Mhm.
many others. But for you, was dissecting each man's behavior helpful in your survival?
Absolutely. Better the devil you know, right? Like, you need to know who you're dealing with. And I always knew I was intuitive about other people and not so much about myself, clearly. But I'm a very good people reader, and I really hone those skills because A, my survival depended on it, and B, I didn't have anything else to do. So I watched them like I was watching TV all day long. And I really think that that helped me. Paul he wasn't able to time things out the way I was in terms of like asking for stuff. Or, even it could be even like, can I move my mat out of the sun into the shade? You had to time a request like that
Hmm.
really precisely, and I could start to predict their moods and who in collaboration or like in who was sitting next to who and what their moods would be like. I mean, I got really good at it towards the end.
Were you also watching to find out if the effects of the cot was wearing off?
Yeah, I mean, they would just fall asleep. So it was best to ask them when they were high because then, they don't care so much what you're doing.
Yeah, now Jessica, one of the things that I want all of the viewers and the listeners to grasp from this interview is how PTSD is created in one's body, their mind, maybe even their spirit. Because PTSD, ladies and gentlemen, is a real condition that has ended the lives of our military servicemen and women,
Mhm.
police officers, those who struggle with the memory of their past terror. Now,
Mhm.
you describe the constant daily terror in your book. Never once in 93 days did you have a sense of rest or peace, not even a good night's sleep. So, living with terrorists high on this herb and their unpredictable behavior never showed a sign of ending. So, what did you
Mhm.
learn about fear that you didn't know before?
Hmm. Well, it's all consuming and it doesn't take a break. And just because you move out of the situation doesn't mean you're not going to still have those feelings. You know, I often call the next part of my life surviving survival. So, not only, surviving the trauma is one thing, but the surviving the survival is a whole other can of worms that I just don't think we talk about enough. And so I'm very committed to talking more about that because it is an epidemic of its own, that is really, what is the hard part is, when you're in the middle of your trauma, all you have to do is just survive the trauma. That's it. You just have to breathe. You just have to stay alive. Like, at the end of the day, that's pretty simple for some situations. But surviving survival, man, that's tough. That's tough because people expect you to be normal again. You're out of the fear, you're out of the trauma. You do a little bit of therapy, you've got food, you've got shelter, you can go back to work. It's none of that. It's taken me 10 years to put my life back together.
And,
And it's 93 days is really not that long in the like span of a kidnapping. People are usually held for much longer, but it could have been 93 seconds. Doesn't matter how long it is. It's the impact that it has on your body and your mind, and it'll last a lifetime.
Yeah, and I've heard stories, I've read stories of our military, especially when they were in Iraq or
Mhm.
Afghanistan of all things.
Mhm.
And a lot of the soldiers that are doing the groundwork, snipers,
Mhm.
of just and the thing I would hear over and over again was the constant fear that
Mhm.
never went away. You did not know was what I would be alive the next second, and this is
Mhm.
going on. So, ladies and gentlemen, think about this. Jessica's 93 days in captivity was constant. It was terror. It was fear. It was unpredictable. There was unknown circumstances and situations going on. It's almost like being poked with a stick, and the poking never stops.
Mhm.
And then when it does
Yeah.
stop, you still feel the poking.
Mhm.
Is that pretty
Because
much
it's
like it
been
is?
rubbed raw. Yeah, it's been rubbed raw,
Now,
and it'll take a lifetime to heal.
are there things that bother you? I mean, if you saw a sleep
Mhm.
mat, does that bring back the movie of the 93 days?
Maybe, but not in a bad way. I think the things that I still have a hard time with are loud noises, especially in the car. I can't deal with, I have two little kids, so like they get loud when you're on a road trip or something. And loud music in the car, all that noise together, just my anxiety like goes through the roof. Um, I can't. I've been through so much trauma treatment regarding that, and it's just not something that I can do. So I do like things very quiet in general. Like I try to have a very quiet life because loud sounds and all the talking and the chattering, it really, um, it hits that nerve, right? That
Right.
raw spot.
Yeah, and through the whole 93 days, um, was the thought of your possible immediate death always on your mind
Yes.
every single
Yep.
day?
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah, because if it's not them, then it might be the explosives that are piled up in the back of the car, or I'm sick.
and you were very sick during
Mhm.
this time. And I know
Mhm.
that you were dealing with a unimaginable urinary tract infection. And ladies, you can
Mhm.
understand, but think about having it for 93 days and never going away. And
Mhm.
I mean, that just made everything to me just even magnified, even just
Mhm.
a UTI. But
Mhm.
I want to quote you because there was something you said in your book that I kind of replayed over and over in my mind. And
Mhm.
you said in your book that the best I could come up with was the notion that if unimaginably bad things can strike against all odds, then the chance of some sort of miraculous escape must also exist. I had to
Mhm.
find ways to live long enough for one to appear. Did you
Mhm.
think during your time in captivity that a miracle was possible?
A miracle's always possible.
I love that.
Always.
I love that.
Yeah.
I
Always.
love that. Now,
So yeah, you
yeah.
think for sure I might die today, and I might not.
Yeah, even reading your story, we're never, for us, the reader, will never truly comprehend that terror. But,
Mhm.
you know, but I was looking through as I was reading, trying to find those little pieces of strength, pieces of hope. And many nights under the stars, and most likely surveillance drones and satellites, you sang a song. And I'm sure under your breath most of the time. What was the song, and was it something that gave you hope and something to hold on to?
Well, I sing lots of songs. I think the one you're referring to, because I'll be honest, it's been a little while since I've read my own book. But
Your mother.
yes, um I don't understand your ways. Is that what the one? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so.
And it was a song that we played at my mother's memorial service, but I will give you my song. And so I think a lot of the songs that I sang and a lot of the mantras and a lot of the verses that I held on to had a lot to do with just that surrender, right? Like just not understanding, but choosing to trust. And I talked to my mom so much. You know, there were two stars that came out at the same time every night. And I didn't know that until I spent all that time out there. Um, and I would tell her all the things that I hadn't had a chance to tell her when she was here. And it's weird to think about like that somebody who's gone on ahead of you that you can have an incredibly like bonding experience with them, but it was, even if it was just with her memory or her spirit as I felt it in that time. But um I knew she had God's ear, and I tried not to abuse it too much, but that like 93rd night I said, you know, you've got to do something here because it's not looking good. You know, I'm hallucinating with fever. I'm in so much pain. Um, if you don't go and tell God to do something, get me out of yeah, I don't think I'm gonna make it much longer.
And that's where I want to go. I want to go to the night of the rescue.
Hmm.
You were laying on your mat out in the open, and the deepest, darkest cave you've ever been immersed in, the feeling of total hopelessness.
Hmm.
And then you said, I think it's fair to say I was beaten then. Why then and not earlier?
I think that, you know, my mind felt strong still, but my body, I didn't feel like it had much left in it. I moved into a kidney infection and I needed antibiotics. I needed to get out of the desert. I needed an IV. I needed medical help, and it didn't look like I was going to get that. And it felt, yeah, I guess it felt like, okay, my body was taking over and it just couldn't keep going for much longer. And so then you have to accept, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no amount of like positive thinking that's going to get me out of this one.
Exactly.
uh,
Well, then the rescue happened. So
mhm.
explain the moment of your rescue.
Well, I mean, I even once they started pulling the blankets down, I mean, the night just erupts into automatic gunfire. I had no idea that anybody was in the camp or even close. They were completely silent. And Dair, helper, he was sleeping next to me. He stands up and I can't see anything because it's just really dark. It's just dark sky and there's the clouds have covered up the stars and there's no moon and um he's just terrified and he's holding a gun and then shots just start automatic gunfire just starts whizzing across me. I'm laying on the ground over me and I'm just trying to get down as low as I possibly can into the ground and disappear. And I think, okay, you know what? This is it. Either I'm going to get shot or it's another group coming to kidnap us because that was always a threat. That was always a fear. It still never crossed my mind that it could be help. I don't know why. Um, until somebody grabs my shoulders and my legs and pulls the blankets down and then they identify themselves and say, um, we're the American military. We're here to take you home. You're safe now.
But they
And
called
then
you
all I
by
can,
your name, and
yeah.
that's when you knew something was different.
Well, he sounded like my baby brother. I was like, wait a second. What? First of all, no one had called me by my name in 93 days. They gave me a Somali name. Um, and was this young American man, and I thought, how? And that's what all I could say when they identified themselves. All I could say over and over again is, "You're American? Wait a second, you're American? Like I don't understand. You're American." You know, and then shock just took over, and I just started shaking. and I couldn't talk, I couldn't speak. I don't think I spoke for 3 or 4 hours afterwards.
And everything moved so fast
Mhm.
in the dark of night. And that night you had the feeling of defeat or
Mhm.
hopelessness. The
Mhm.
strange setting of all of the terrorists laying on the ground asleep, no one
Mhm.
awake. You couldn't get anybody to wake up because you were trying to ask permission to go
Mhm.
relieve
To
yourself
the yeah.
to the
Yeah, I was
bush,
sick. Yep.
but it was eerily quiet and incredibly dark. So, as I'm reading it, so in my own hours of thinking about your 93rd night in captivity, I was reminded of the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And the
Mhm.
men were asleep, just like the lions were asleep, and no harm came to Daniel. And I
Mhm.
kept thinking, and I'm putting your story together, and all I could think of that night, that all the prayers of all of those back home praying for you, they reached the throne of God,
Mhm. Mhm.
plain and simple.
Mhm.
And then I had to look it up. I said, the definition of a miracle. It's miracles are seals of a divine mission. And it was those
Mhm.
Navy SEALs that were on a divine
Mm.
mission and were used to perform that very miracle. And as you had said, to find ways to live long enough for one to appear, and it
Mhm.
did. What
Mhm.
did that all mean to you?
I am so loved, and again, I am nothing special. I always say, like, I'm just a school teacher from Ohio, just a girl. Um, but I know now what I mean to my creator. And I went when all of this happened, I was not in a good place spiritually. I was so angry about losing my mother and in the way that it happened. And I felt abandoned.
Mm.
And I don't know why it happened the way it did for me, but there is not a day that goes by that I do not sit and ponder in gratitude and thanksgiving for just the chance to feel loved, um, by so many, for sure, but by the one who created me. And I feel, that I would think about that saying oftentimes, and as we, I guess, wrap up, I think about those who are feeling like they are in the den, or they are at the end of their rope, or they're at the darkest point they've ever been in their lives right now. And I just want to remind people that the darkest night always is before the dawn, always. And I
And there,
remember thinking that when I was sick. I got up and it was so dark. There was no moon. The clouds had covered up the stars. And I remember thinking of a song from my childhood that had something to do with the darkest night being just before the dawn, and thinking how significant that was. And I think about that still, that we are never without hope.
uh,
We are
I'm
never without hope.
I am so glad you said that, because a lot of people need to hear those
Mhm.
very words. We are never
Mhm.
without hope. Hope
Mhm.
is what keeps us going to realize
Mhm.
that the miracle is there, and
Yeah.
there can be a miracle. Maybe not
Yeah.
everybody gets to experience the miracle that they wait on,
Mhm.
but many do. And
Right.
thinking back, it's almost like that whole night was set up. Everything was done as it. I mean, and there were, when I'm reading it and trying to put myself into your sandals, so to speak, and lay on that mat and have a horrible UTI, and everything is not as it was the same 92 nights before. Something was
Mhm.
different.
Mhm.
And, you know, only God can create something like that.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking the whole time, because every soldier never got up. And you even brought up the whole point too. Nobody was on guard. Nobody's eyes were
Mm-mm.
open to make sure that you and your colleague didn't escape. And
Mhm.
but those lions were made to
Yeah.
sleep for a reason.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely. Yep.
well, I'm going to ask you just one more question before we go. How would you explain how you lived life before the kidnapping versus how you live your life now afterwards?
Mm. Well, first of all, time, I'm very cognizant of time and I don't like to waste it. Um, I often think like, what's today? Today is August 18th, 2021, and I'll think, the world will never have another August 18th, 2021. Like this is it. Um, so I work really hard to make every single day meaningful. I do not waste my moments. Um, Sometimes I maybe put more meaning in some areas than others. But I'm just really aware of the gift of life. Um, and I work really hard to just make it mean something to myself and to everyone that I come into contact with. I feel
Yeah,
like I have a responsibility in some ways. Survivors, I think, feel that way to figure out what the meaning of all of this is. Um, and it's a journey, it's my life's journey. And I'm lucky to be here to get to continue moving in it.
well, Jessica, we are so happy that you're still here.
Thank you. I am too.
And ladies and gentlemen, we have, as I've said before, we have one life to live. Don't waste it.
Mm-mm.
Jessica, you got literally a second chance.
I did.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you with this. Miracles are seals of a divine mission. And in case of Jessica Buchanan, those seals were dressed in black, covered in Kevlar, and 60 pounds of body armor. Some angels will appear in the dark of night, equipped with night vision and enough firepower to prove God hears the prayers of the hopeful as well as the hopeless. I'll see you next time.